without any further ado, we'll forge ahead with, I think we've got a bit of a mixed audience from what I can tell. So I might start with a bit of a zoom out into names more generally, and then we'll work our way in towards the kind of specifics of a project that we've had running very low key in the background here in the Botanics for almost 25 years, or a bit more now even, and just slowly but surely collecting from text, so purely from written sources, along with a few little others that sneak in as well when we've had a chat with someone, all the names of plants and many fungi that we can find in Scotland. And it's quite an astonishing number when we get to that for a relatively small flora that we have. So without further ado, we're going to zoom out and look at that classic thing of why we need names in the first place. So I like this example to kind of often start off with. It's that one of, if you're asked to go out and get me, a mushroom, a toadstool with a brown cap and a kind of pale stalk and dots on the top, that would be hugely appreciated because I'm feeling quite hungry. I haven't had any food yet at all. And you could go out, have a wander around, and you could bring me back, if you're in the right habitat, either of these things. So if you're in the supermarket or maybe out and about in the wild in quite a lot of temperate areas, you might come back with this pale sort of stiped, pale stalked, kind of brown palliace, the brown cap there with these white dots on the surface. And I'd be delighted because I would, of course, have shiitake, one of the most delicious of the fungi in a culinary sense. And if I was unlucky and you went out and got me something with a pale stipe and a brown palliace and these little dots on the top as well, then what would happen to me, do you think? I might keel over. Or if I was an Italian student, and for some reason Italian students do seem to have a slightly different take on this particular mushroom, I might be quite delighted in a kind of slightly hallucinogenic kind of way, I think is the one for this. So we have panther cap on the right, quite a toxic fungus, one of these things you wouldn't want to mistake. But it always seems to be a thing where I've talked to Italian students that they'll go, oh, that's a very interesting fungus indeed. So a different perception of that. Whereas shiitake, I think universally we can agree, are really quite delicious indeed. And these long descriptions of plants and fungi are very, very clumsy. They aren't things that work very well in terms of trying to convey things. So of course, you have things reduced down to a far more manageable binomial. So these Linnaean binomials for things like we have here, this is Prunus spinosa, so the sloe, or the blackthorn, or the bulister, or any one of these names in Scotland. This is just a small selection of them. But we've got in Scots Strath and Bulister, this kind of quite archaic name there, and in Gaelic a whole host of different names as well. And all of these apply to the same taxon that we'd recognise in science. So in science, we think about Prunus spinosa, and botanists and ecologists and people who are good at identifying plants and people who are good at making gin with sloes in it as well can identify it. And we'd all go for that same species, if you like. And when you look at the corresponding names in each of these languages we use in Scotland, there's a really close one-to-one match. And that's something that's quite interesting when we look at Scots and kind of Gaelic and English names and compare them in with the taxonomic names, is where things match one-to-one versus where there's different kinds of mismatches as well. So these are telling us about different taxonomies, different ways that different groups of people have linguistically at looking at the world. So we'll kick off with a little look at a few taxonomic names, some with a bit of Scots focus. So here's our Prunus spinosa with our generic name Prunus, which tells us it's related to the other prunuses, many of the other stone fruits that are out there. We have our specific epithet Spinosa, which tells us what? What do you think? I've got like a nice binomial like this is good because it tells us it's spiny, and that's nice and accurate. It helps us with the ID for things. And then, of course, you often get that authority or the author name on the end as well. So in this case, L for Linnaeus, who came up with that binomial system or kind of codified it for science, essentially. So that's a really useful kind of combination. With one little thing just to watch out for in a very kind of spectacle adjusting kind of geeky way is when you look at Prunus spinosa, that's the species name. Okay, that's the name of the species because you can't have Spinoza on its own. It doesn't really tell you anything. There are lots and lots of Spinozas out there, but you need to tie it into Prunus to make sense that you're talking about this combination of genus and species. So that'll be familiar to many people, I'm sure, and as will many of the sources of many of these names. So a whole host of these names come from classical sources. So you can look at Pliny, you could look at Herodotus, Dioscorides, the writers on agriculture like Cato and Varro, and the people who were natural historians 2,000 years ago were recording a whole host of really interesting plants, lots of which we have a reasonable feel for what they were talking about. So things like Lolion here probably matches fairly closely. Certainly it was a grass and probably a rough grass. It might match fairly closely with what we think of as the genus Lolium, but we can't be completely certain. Things like Quercus, the oaks, probably have a really close match. When someone was talking about a classical oak as Quercus, then they're probably talking about the same thing that we think of as Quercus today. For some, we have Zostera, for example, there. That's just nicely descriptive of the look of this the leaf that we have for these marine plants. And it was my very thinly veiled way to get Z into this as an alphabetical thing, I have to be honest. But yeah, it's from the Greek for belt or band, nicely descriptive of that leaf. Things like Clematis alpina. So Clematis, again, a kind of classical name, and then that alpina for a specific epithet, really nice descriptive of its habitat type. So you've got all these nice descriptive names, and there are lots of potential sources for these. So Lathyrus lineifolius, possibly one of my very favourite plants, and really beloved by Robert Sibbald, who was the founder of the garden here. He spent a lot of time researching this, particularly for the tubers at the base with their kind of interesting stories about them suppressing appetite and various other tales about them being really useful for flavouring up whiskey, for example. There was a really quite intriguing plant, but its current specific epithet is lineifolius, which implies it has nice, slender little leaflets in this case, which you can kind of just about see in the background there. But of course, if you've ever found this plant in the field, 50% of them, more than that, have really quite broad leaflets, and it's not a consistent character at all. It's almost my favourite one has to be a plant just outside here from Chile rather than Scotland, Hydrangea ceratifolia. So it's called Hydrangea ceratifolia. And what does that imply about the margin of the leaf? Ceratifolia. Lovely serrations, lovely kind of saw marks on the edge. And of course, the key thing about that was that the person that described it originally for science was doing it based on a specimen that had been eaten around the edges by an insect. So the actual ones in the wild don't have serrated leaves at all. So be a bit careful about where these names are coming in from. They're not always perfect by any means. Some of them are absolutely exquisite. So this is one I might have mentioned before in a much earlier talk to BSS, but I love Acanthium is spiny. So really nice and descriptive of this very spiny thistle, sometimes thought to be the heraldic one for Scotland. So it has that Scottish connection, although it is a Mediterranean species. And its Mediterranean, one of its references is to the fact that it's kind of eaten a lot by donkeys. So it's one of the few things that donkeys will, or donkeys are one of the few animals that can get through all these bristles and spines and enjoy this. But it has quite a significant effect on them. So in Greek, onopordon means the donkey's fart. So the beautiful heraldic device of Scotland relates to the fact that it makes donkeys flatulent. So just, yeah, not the best, I have to say. But you get lots of these beautiful names coming in kind of actively chosen scientific binomials. And I really like that. You get lots of other sources for things as well. So quite a lot that come in from indigenous languages as well. So Araucaria Araucana is a great example of using one of the Mapuche dialects and just feeding that in directly to the taxonomic name. So Arauca is one of the names for this species in its wild Chile. Perhaps the tackiest of them all has to be Begonia darfvederiana, and it's something that's the kind of thing that paleontologists do or zoologists do. They're a bit more, it's not to be too judgmental, but a little bit kind of crasser in choosing names. And it's very, very rare to have something like this, but it's a begonia with a very dark, glossy leaf. So appropriately descriptive of Darth Vader's cape, I think, is where that kind of comes from. So we've got all these really interesting names. Sometimes they change. So things like this, I don't know if it'll have changed back by the end of the talk, potentially. But at the moment, we've got a lot of flux going on with taxonomic names at the moment. So this thing here is Potentilla fruticosa, or it was till 12 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. It's now become Dasyphora fruticosa. Okay, and the reason for that is because with a lot of the molecular work, the DNA work that's going on at the moment, botanists are recognizing things are not quite classified perfectly, so we're just rejigging things a little bit. And it can upset people, potentially understandably at times. So we've got, as I say, Potentilla fruticosa is a name that people have known for a long time for the shrubby cinquefoil, but it's shifting over to Dasyphora fruticosa has frustrated a few people. There's a funny thing though. It seems to be that whenever these names change and something isn't found to be as closely related to a group as it was in before and gets moved out into another group and has to get a new name, it always seems to be, not so much in this case, but it always seems to be the original name's small and easy to remember, and the new name's like 55 syllables long and really complex. But that's not botanists being cruel at all. It's just often that's what's where old names for these that have to be resurrected. And as I say, the reason for that is this. We're doing a lot of this work on the phylogenetics, and as I say, it kind of rejigs a little bit about classifications. It'll be less and less so as we go through. But I don't know, have you got your own personal, you can shout them out and I can repeat them. Has anyone got their own personal bugbear amongst name changes?
Horoserica.
Ophrys horoserica become. Oh, right. So that's a kind of a specific epithet that's gone and changed.
Because somebody dug out an old paper.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Oh, it doesn't tell us anything useful.
Yep. Yeah. Like I like those ones that have got a nice bit of description are often much more helpful for things. That's it. Cool. Yeah, I suspect lots of gardeners seem to have one where it's their favourite garden plant. Seems to have changed. So that's a wee bit of an overview of how things work, I guess, for taxonomy. It'll be familiar for many people, but just keep that in mind as we go over and look at these vernacular kind of common names, particularly with that kind of Scottish focus, because a lot of the same kind of questions come up about that, the multiple names that we have available, how we apply them, and quite what we apply them to, and the way that we use these taxonomies of thinking. So if we look widely again at the sources of names that we have, in our scientific binomials, it's the same kind of thing that you find across language more widely for plants as well. So things like this, papa, recorded as papa in a kind of Sumerian, that's our best interpretation of what it might have been called, is papaver. It's poppy in English, and in Gaelic it's papin. And sometimes that's interpreted as it might be relating to a pap or teats. And that might be because it produces this latex. And that might just be me over-interpreting stuff. And that's one of the big dangers when it comes to lots of these common names and vernacular names, is there's lots of really rich stories that are out there and really interesting, and lots of interesting connections we can make. But it's kind of dangerous to do that, I think, because it starts to make names change and evolve. And if you're lucky, you can sometimes see how these names have evolved in the past as a letter gets changed and its meaning changes entirely and it adopts a new story behind it. There's a whole host of these really interesting wee ones there, but I would caution people to be a bit kind of careful about that. But the key thing here is that all across all these Indo-European languages, even that pre-Indo-European language of Sumerian, they're all kind of the same. And poppy tends not to have that many other names. We've got a few that kind of might relate to tying in with it being a corn rose or something like that. It looks a little bit like a rose and you find it in cornfields. There's a few that pop up like that. But generally speaking, the name poppy or something like it is very stable through all these languages. And probably that's because A, it's really, really identifiable, and B, it's very, very useful. So that medicinal use and kind of ritual use, and now I guess increasingly the kind of the like narcotic use as well that's had through the ages, means that it's a very fixed and stable name. You see a very similar thing for something like birch. So again, across many, many Indo-European languages, they're basically just slight corruptions of the same thing. And that's because birch is incredibly easy to identify. and universally useful and probably tied in with many of these Indo-European groups. It would be a familiar tree no matter where you are throughout much of Europe. So we have these names popping up just in slight variants again and again. So all these outside influences in wider Europe and beyond have all fed in to Scotland and the languages that we have in Scotland. So the focus of the study that we did, if that long-running study, was predominantly on looking at English to some extent, Scots and Gaelic. And as I say, it's just culling together literary names. What we haven't done, and it's something that we're really keen to develop in the future and look at funding for, is to really go out and find out actively how language is being used now. So what are the active and kind of most current ways that people go about naming plants in these languages in Scotland as well. So it's a bit of a kind of a recording exercise that we have here, but it's thrown up some really interesting stuff. So it's thrown up stuff like just beautiful names like this beautifully romantic flapper bags, which I think is just perfect, beautifully descriptive of Petasites. So this is our kind of potentially quite large weaved riverine species that we have here. Lots and lots of other names that it has available. So I guess what would you call this? No, what would you go for its kind of main common name, I guess? Butterbur probably is the one that universally folk go for. So we've used in the past to wrap up butter, and that's kind of where it potentially gets that name. It's also known, one of these several things known as son before father, because you have the flowers coming up before the leaves do, which is a bit the wrong way around for things, and many other names. But flapper bags is just beautifully evocative because maybe a month and a half ago, if you went down to any river and you saw this growing, it would just look like old dead plastic bags, which I think is just beautifully descriptive of what it's like. So these flapper bags. And then we've got this, which I'm sure you all know what the plant is. But have you come across that name? So this is bumpipe. Let me introduce you to bumpipe. What we go for the kind of main common name for this, I think it's a good one to. That's a good dandelion, a reliable dandelion, I think, that one there. So Taraxacum, one of the species or the microspecies of dandelion, we'll pick up on a few other names it has as well in a bit. But has anyone ever come across it called that, really? It seems to be just a very small bit of Lanarkshire. So my dad's from Coatbridge, and he's one of the few people that I can say, have you heard of the name? I don't think he knows it exactly as this, but he knows another organism that has bum in its name. And actually, we all know that organism to have bum in its name as well, in a slightly different kind of context. And it's the bumblebee. Okay, so in parts of Lanarkshire, bumblebee, and maybe more widely, is a foggy bummer. Have you ever come across that term at all? Well, I'm shocked. But yeah, so my dad, he grew up knowing all about foggy bummers in Lanarkshire, and it's nothing to do with anything rude whatsoever. I have to kind of emphasize that. The bum part is the noise it makes. So the bumblebee bumbling along isn't because it's got an erratic flight. It's because it's going bum, bum, bum. And that name comes in from the hum. And the name for the plant comes in from the fact that you could break off that capitulum, break off the flower head, and break off that peduncle that you've got there, the big stalk for all those flowers. And it's a hollow tube, of course. You'll get the milky latex coming out of it. And of course, you've got that secondary effect that if you touch it at all, it will make you wet the bed, which is a well-known phenomenon. That's not necessarily true, but it does pop up in various names. But you can take that and you can blow through it and make a humming noise. And it's because kids would play with this when they were wee, and they would make a humming noise that it gets the name bumpipe, because you can make a hum with it. It's a bit like a kazoo, as I say. So we get all these names coming in, and they're quite elaborate backgrounds, especially ones where it's children who are developing the names. And I kind of almost want a show of hands to see who made up your own names for plants when you were a kid. I know I definitely did. You might need to search the depths of your memory, but there will be some. Very often there are some where people, I think, have. Yeah, I might need to have a wee ask around after we're finished. Yeah. So have a bit of a ponder if you can, and you might suddenly remember the rosemary willow herb. You would strip the top off that and strip all the leaves off and throw it at your brothers with javelins for us. So I don't know if that's a general name. It was how we used it, so it became javelins. And many of these kids' names will pop into language and kind of find their way there. And what's interesting to see is, I know we said about birch and poppy having quite a fixed name set. It's quite limited for, in spite of them being very easy to identify and famous. In some ways, you might expect them to adopt more names, but there are some easy to identify, useful, ubiquitous plants that for some reason have developed and absorbed lots and lots of names. And I suspect quite a lot of them are sometimes born out of frustration of gardeners and farmers, sometimes born out of how kids will play with them, and sometimes if they're used medicinally or have a few different interesting features. And dandelion's a really great one. So dandelion, of course, is great because it looks like a lion with a mane. Yeah. So it is written down as dandy lion, a lion that looks very, sort of confident in itself and kind of swaggers about, because it's a good descriptive thing. But of course, it's got nothing to do with dandelion as the term that we take it in, which of course is don de leon. It's that lion's tooth that sits under the ground, that big taproot that's the key thing. It's the lion's tooth there. But it's picked up all these other names, maybe things like piss a bed or pee the bed, and variants on that are from its supposed use as a diuretic, so for inducing causing people to pee. Doon heed clock, yeah. Is everyone doon as down, like kind of thistle down, and heed for head, and clock because you can tell the time very reliably with it. So that's coming in with a kind of a really reliable kind of a identifiable children's name one there as well. So a whole host of really interesting one. Bitter flavors, exiger, so like this kind of yellow grass, and we've got milk gowan as well, so the kind of the latex there as a kind of milk. So what's interesting to see, it's got all of these names, but they're all applied to dandelions as a whole. So the specialists in dandelions will pick them apart, understandably, into lots of microspecies. And there are many, many microspecies of dandelions and reliable species of dandelions out there, but there's not a one-to-one match in any case that we can see reliably between any of these common names and any of individual microspecies. They're all lumped together as one. Okay, and that kind of makes sense because not everybody's a specialist Taraxacum microspecies. In fact, one or two people are, and that's it. Okay. How about this? Where do we go? Oh, I'm hearing sticky willow, maybe. There was a goose grass there. Cleavers, yep, these are good, yep, nice, reliable. And how do you, were these all the names that you grew up with them? Who knows them as sticky willow or sticky willy? I think that's probably most people. How about goosegrass as the main one? Or cleavers as the main one? So, and maybe there might be a few others. There's Jack running the hedge and a batch of other English kind of common names as well for things. And there's lots and lots of different names for that. But again, this is probably one that comes down to children's games. And my favourite is this. I don't know if people in the front can make it out, but Bleedy Tongues there comes from a children's game where you would take a leaf and you would get your friend to stick out their soon-to-be not friend to stick out their tongue. And you'd get the leaf with these little hooks on them and you'd rub it down their tongue and it would give them a bleeding tongue. It's, just a really nice romantic source for this name. I think it's quite superb. And I love that. I love how all these names are coming in from a whole host of different places, but kids are superb at generating them, I have to say. So we find that some taxa have got lots and lots of names. Some have got relatively few. This one here is a good example. So Troilus europaeus here is quite a lot of different names, just even in Scots. So we've got bull jumping, little orthographic variants or kind of like changes there. Butterblob's a really nice descriptive term, as is cabbage daisy. Not a daisy at all, but it looks kind of cabbage-like. And we see this interesting thing for daisies, so the composites, Asteraceae, very often being lumped in with the very distantly related buttercups and their allies. Okay, they're often kind of chucked together with a lot of the kind of common names because they're quite attractive, quite easy to identify, and often yellow in many cases as well. Most of these, Lacker, Locker, Lucken, Luggy, and maybe witches. These all relate to that closed over, locked over looking flower. So it's quite different from most other typical ranunculaceae that you would expect with that kind of distinctive closed over flower. And gowan is a name that pops up across, as I say, a whole host of different things. Basically, if a flower's got a bit of gold in it, so gowan coming from gold in Scots, it seems to be a valid target for having one of these gowan names. So each of these, so even though this daisy here on the right here has got these white outer ray florets, it's not exclusively golden, it still gets the name gowan. Okay, and daisies often adopt these kind of gowan names, as do things like this Caltha palustris here on the left as well. And in pulling together this big database that we have, essentially a huge big spreadsheet of names, and that's been the work of a host of people over a long time, it's been interesting to see which ones come out on the top with the most names. Generally speaking, every plant will have its standardized BSBI approved Common English name, and most plants have got their standardized Gallic names as well that were suggested over the last sort of 20, 30 years. Okay. Scots, there's not standardized Scots names, but even if you take our sort of 1,200 species of vascular plants and they all have an English common name and they all have a Gallic common name, that makes 2,400 names that we can kind of discount because they're all standardized. And I don't know if you could kind of vaguely guess for those 1,200 species, how many more names we've managed to collate together across that. So in addition to our 2,400 standard names, there's about 6,000 other names that are applied to plants in Scotland. And that's not going to be Carex acuta floris or any of the little things, the little obscure things. The vast majority of these names are applied against the really obvious, easy to identify top 100 or so. So things like Caltha palustris really come out on top. Marsh marigold, easy to identify, not necessarily particularly useful, but a cheerful plant and a kind of thing that people would see very often, and one that's easy to just throw names at. This list does have lots of things that have got orthographic variants, where you'll have gowan or gowan. So it is slightly inflates what names we're seeing there. But it gives you an idea. Many of these are the kind of things that people today could still potentially comfortably identify. So they're really quite straightforward things. Okay. So we'll just have a quick whip through a few sources of names in Scots, Gaelic, and English as examples. So some names come from other plants. So Pinus sylvestris, very commonly in the past, if you look at historical texts from 1850s and earlier, even a little bit more recently, we'll very commonly call that the Scotch fir. Okay, Scotch because you find it in Scotland, and fir because it looks like any of these other pine type things like firs and spruces. So often people not distinguishing between spruce, fir and pine at all. And that often relates to the wood as well. Here, Juniperus communis pops up both in Scots and sort of adapted in Gaelic as savin. And savin's quite an interesting one because it is another Juniperus, but it's Juniperus sabina, which is a toxic species from around the Mediterranean area. But savin seems to have migrated up and become the kind of the main common name for Juniperus communis as well in Scots. We have some names coming in from animals, and I really love stag's horn club moss. It's great. So it's just rife with animal connections. So stag's horn club moss relates to its branching pattern. It looks like a stag's horn. We've got foxfix and musbalgar. The two of these names both relate to foxes. Okay. Now, this is in its taxonomic name. It's Lycopodium. So Lycopodium is the foot of a wolf. Okay. But of course, we killed off all the wolves in Scotland by the 1750s. So you can't call it wolf's foot. In Scots and Gaelic, you have to call it fox's foot because that's the closest thing that we have to a wolf, relating to these kind of little hairy microphiles, the little hairy leaves on the surface. So it's got lots and lots of names that tie it in with animals across all these different languages. Adder's spear or adder's tongue is really nice, relating to this tongue-like central fertile frond, and we've got the frond at the back there that's like the head of an adder. And the belief from that, of course, was that it would be useful in treating snake bites. It wasn't effective, but the idea of it being a bit like the doctrine of signatures, where if you've got something that looks like a particular condition, it can be used to treat it or cure it. And that's what we see here as well, both in its taxonomic name and in its common name. This Peltigera canina is called canina because you can just about make out there these little rhizoids, these little spikes on the bottom of this lichen. It's kind of a ground-dwelling lichen. And the spikes on it look like the teeth of dogs. So it was useful for treating rabies. Okay. Ineffective, unfortunately. But with a disease like rabies, you have to turn to what you can in that hope that there's something that will cure it. So it's picked that name up in its use through formal medicine, and it fell out of fashion through the 1700s as people started to look a bit more empirically at things. But Peltigera, canina, and dog-like, and the name still remains. Here we've got horsetails, which relate to the full vegetative frond of these things, but they're paddock pipes in Scots. And that's quite nice because that might grow in a paddock, or it might relate to paddocks or puddocks. So the pipes, a puddock is a frog. So the pipes that a frog plays, because quite often they're associated with growing in kind of wet places. And there's a few other kind of pipe-like plants that are called paddock or puddock pipes as well. Here we've got a plant named for its utility and its use. So in English, butterwort, butter plant, and earning grass, ecogurst, yearninggurst, banamation, these ones, the butter mixer and all these are used because of its relation to the dairy industry. So dropping a plant into milk would curdle it and you could use it to make cheese. So it was effectively like a rennet. And that might be with the enzymes on the surface that this carnivore uses to digest its fly prey. It might be those that are acting to kind of curdle the milk. So it was quite significant, again, in Lanarkshire as something that was collected in many parts of Ireland as well and used in the dairy industry. And a lot of these names come through from that, as you can see. These are kind of more northern Scots names there. But you've also got rock grass and sheeproot, and these tie into the fact that if you graze your sheep out and they eat this plant, it was blamed for causing rot in the feet of the sheep. And it's not really this plant's fault. It was just associated with it. But it's the idea, if you go and graze your sheep in the habitat this likes, which is wet bogs, then they'll have foot rot anyway. But the poor plant gets accused of causing the disease and it gets called rotgrass. Okay. And then we're back to a really great kids one. And this is something in the summertime when you have the chance, when this is back up, you have to try this kind of low-key conkers game. So this is, of course, Plantago lanceolata, and it's got this inflorescence. The flower head there is great, where you can pick one. And if you done, who's done this one? Where it's pretty good. There's a couple of quite brutal ones, aren't there? So the classic one is you do the tie the knot in it and then pop it off, and you can flick it at a friend. But that's meant to be Mary Queen of Scots got her head chopped off is one of its elaborate names because it's about that execution thing. Or alternatively, the other one where it gets names like Fechters and Carl Doddies. So Carl is Charles and Doddy is George. So this is actually a horrible sectarian name. Okay, it's like the kind of Charles and George, the kind of Jacobean and sort of following dynasties, and the whole Hanoverian house, and that kind of conflict between Catholic and Protestant. And the way that you would have your fight between Charles and George is one of you would take one stem like that, and your opponent would take another. And you would just a bit like conkers. So if you were holding it, you'd hold it so that the head was there, and you've got a bit of exposed peduncle, it's a stalk there, and you have to whip the top off your enemy's bit of plant. You've got this kind of quite successful way of fighting each other. And if you're feeling really quite unpleasant, you can whip it with their hands as well. I don't know, do people just not do that much anymore? Because I remember doing that. Maybe it's my brothers. I think it's growing up with too many brothers. That's the one. And then you've got things from body parts. So things like there's lots of things called dead men's fingers or witches' fingers or fairies' fingers or these kind of things, often associated with quite sinister things. So things like our Digitalis purpurea, toxic plant there, and with these flowers that look a bit like kind of fingertips there. Other dead men's fingers are often things that relate to roots that sit under the ground and you have to dig them up, like digging up the dead. We've got Jenny's blue eye, like Veronica Camedris, and here we've got Judas's ear. So here, this is the ear of Judas Iscariot growing on elder. And we've got saintly names as well. So we've got body parts, saintly names. We've got things like St. John's wort here for Hypericum perforatum. But in Scotland, it's Muscallum pila, it's St. Columba's plant, because you always go to your main saint, your main kind of heroic saint when you're naming this plant, because it was used as a treatment for banishing devils. So kind of an interpretation of psychiatric conditions like depression, for example, for which it is successfully used even today, but it's got lots of contraindications, so I'm not recommending anyone try anything. But the interpretation from it was that this was a plant that was holy to your most martial sort of military saint, usually St. John, but up in this part of the world, St. Columba, because if you took this medicine that was blessed by that saint, it would help to chase away the demons that were besetting you if you had depression. So really interesting interpretation of a medicinal use. And here we've got something that's a bit more difficult to tell, but probably tied into St. Bride. It might be to do with the bright golden flowers of dandelion, but this is almost certainly one where we've got a significant influence of Irish Gaelic rather than Gaelic. So we might have a wee word about that at some point. Be cool for those who speak fluent Gaelic. So we've got devilish things as well. So lots and lots of examples of devils plants, but I particularly like this one here because it's so perfectly descriptive of what looks like one of the tastiest things you can imagine. And it would taste nice. It'd be quite sweet as well. But this is Deal's cherries. Of course, Atropa belladonna being a pretty toxic thing indeed. And then this wee thing here is devil's snuff box, or deed man sneetching. And the sneetching would be a thing when you take your snuff from as well. So again, that thing, anything on the ground is often associated with the dead. And we've got quite a lot associated with the fairy folk. So stuff like this, quaking grass pops up as fairy grass. And here, lady's bedstraw, again, tying not just to the lady, our lady, so not just the Virgin Mary, but here the fairy folk. So this kind of like the fairy woman's bed or the banshee's bed is here. And lots of these we can trace back. They're easy to work out where they came from. In lots of cases, we can see how the snuff box there, you know, you tap it and the snuff comes out. It's got lots of snuff inside it. It's obviously the spores, but you can work out where these come from. But there are quite a lot where we just don't have a clue where they're from at all. And they throw up some really interesting ones. I'll finish with this one here, because if anyone can get a definite answer for this, you could be onto a winner in veterinary circles. So there's a plant that Alexander Carmichael records in Carmina Gadelica called Torrenon. And he describes the person who informed him about it, talks about it being up in the Western Isles, and it has a flower about the size, he says, of a breast, a woman's breast, and it's white. Now, there's not any plant that fits that description really at all in the British flora, I would say, I suspect. The closest you can kind of maybe think of might be something like one of these umbellifers. It also says that this plant called Torrenon has a cluster of roots at the bottom, which Oenanthe, the water dropworts, do have a cluster of roots at the bottom. They were thought to look a bit like the udders of a cow. Is that run out of battery? No, it's okay. Thought to look like the udders of a cow. So it was actually used to improve milk flow in cattle, and it was supposed to work, which is quite intriguing. You get these lovely little snippets of information. So it sounds like it could be something like water dropwort, even though that's a pretty toxic plant indeed. I wouldn't go giving it to any livestock or eating it yourself, in spite of what you might read in the Times at all. Don't believe that. And what was interesting was Carmichael spoke to the Regis Keeper here at the time, who commissioned someone who was going up to the Western Isles to keep an eye out for this plant Torrenon and bring a sample back. Went up, asked around, Gaelic speaker, brought some samples back, and they brought back this thing here, Scrofularia nodosa, as Torrenin. Now, it's quite interesting. Down at the bottom, it's a waterside plant. Down at the bottom, it's got this cluster of roots, and it is used in veterinary medicine. But that description of the flower as being white and very large really doesn't fit what you find for Scrophularia at all. And that's one of the beautiful things about these names. Lots of them you can trace and track back to where they come from. They're really fascinating stories from children, from ancient Sumeria right through to now. But there's a whole host that are just a total mystery to us. So there's loads more to do out there. And I think, yeah, if anyone wants to get involved, might be worth having a chat at some point. Okay. So at that, folks, thank you very much for your patience. But I do should just also say there's many people that have contributed to over the years to the work. But I'd particularly like to just thank Roger West,